So thank you so much for two really interesting presentations, but just sort of where you're at now and previously. And it seems, Judith, that so much of what you were doing was sort of anticipating how things are now, but probably not with that intention. I mean, I found that so interesting. And George, I know you've been involved with thinking about video and computers for a really long time. So there's so many things to talk about. First of all, I'd like you both address this idea of being immersed in technology, which I think is a really good umbrella, maybe a good place to start. This idea of wanting the participant or the viewer to be immersed inside technology, or technology can do that in a way that looking at a painting, a rectangle on a wall cannot. So I think that's a good place to start. And I think some more conversation about technological anxiety is with us at all times, and afraid that the robots are going to take over, and that conversation. And when we were having our meeting a couple days ago, we were talking about television and how television changed everything. So those are just some places to start. And maybe, George, do you want to talk about television?
Well, the immersion is another, is a very interesting issue, and I think that's one of the reasons this list show is so spectacular, because it's this threshold between this period when artists had to deal with the TV set, which I think to some degree they hated, because it was this ubiquitous piece of furniture in everyone's living room and spewed nonsense or boring nonsense. But it came before, and that's why the title's so wonderful, it came before this immersive medium of video projection. And once that happened, then you could fill an entire box with video and completely immerse yourself, which is always a goal of artists to some degree, going back to the caves, but also Leonardo da Vinci would make these huge immersive environments and stuff. So I think that's one of the reasons I find this show so fascinating, is this moment when people are still trying to figure out, how do we take these TV sets and do something interesting with them? And that's this interesting moment in history. TV is, of course, one of the two inventions of World War II, TV and the computer. And it's interesting that from World War II, from the 40s all the way to the mid-60s, they were both completely under the control of corporations. Right. And there was very little on TV that was palatable to anyone with any real taste. There was art. And then all of a sudden, in both instances, artists started getting their hands on it. And with TV, it was the invention, for the most part, of Sony's Portapak. And Nam June got one of the first ones in New York. And then for computers, it really became the desire of a number of artists to just, I really want to learn what this is about, and can I make art on it? And for the most part, they had to find a mainframe computer someplace. They had to learn an obscure language called Fortran, which was easy to make mistakes in. And they had to work with it in the evenings when nobody else wanted to work with it, because during the day it was an important machine, whoever the corporation was who owned it. Manfred Moore, for example, used the computer at the French Meteorological Society, and he was allowed to come in at night and play with it. So you had these two parallel technologies that sort of took off as art forms in the mid-60s.
Right. So Judith, that's kind of part of your story, I would say, right?
Well, I guess I think television actually was a very difficult medium to subvert, because it was a box, it was an appliance. And when you think about the appliance aspects of the television set, in the US we have this long history where it was home entertainment, And it was, in the living room, and you were supposed to even, if you look at the advertising from the 50s and 60s, when the television comes into being, you were supposed to even dress up. Those Rick Perol films where he got a hold of a lot of these early films of people dancing around their appliances, and the TV figured very largely in that. Whereas if you look at how television comes to other countries, for instance, Spain, the TV set was already just an appendage, and it never occupied the center of the living room, for instance. Like, even today, you go into people's houses in the US, and the TV is in the center of the room, even if nobody's watching it anymore. But so I think, the issue of like the appliance and the apparatus are both, I think, really foundational issues for art's relation. And with the computer, I think, because it was so hard to visualize what it looked like, or even to visualize how it functioned, I think that it's actually had a much slippery way of being used by artists. Because like what you were mentioning about the learning Fortran, and then it was C++, et cetera, and all of the different kinds of computer programs. You often had to work at night, but you could also do really interesting things at night because nobody else was there, and you didn't know what it was because you really didn't know what you could do with it. And I think it led to maybe more interesting formulations of artists, even though it never really, computer art never really entered the mainstream art world the way video did finally when the black box was, there were made, in 1995.
Problems with people really understanding if you made art using a computer, who were you? Well, if the computer did this, who's the artist here?
Right.
They didn't get that.
Well, that was actually the topic of some of the conversations in the mid-'80s when the computer trickled down to everybody else.
Right.
Because people would say, well, who is the best artist in Photoshop? Oh, the computer. And in a way, it was true because it was pre-programmed to let you do certain things and to not let you do other things.
I also think that this is where your concept of anxiety comes in, because the TV, we knew television, and it was sort of our friend, and we're of the generation that grew up with it, the first generation that truly grew up with television. Whereas computers, again, Manfred Moore tells the story in 1972, he's lecturing at the Sorbonne on how he makes his work using computers, and a student stood up and threw an egg at him and said, "How dare you use a computer to make your art? Those are war machines." And so there was a whole...
And they were.
They were,
Yeah.
but they were also many other things,
Right.
And so there was a whole anxiety about the computer that was never there about television.
Right.
Or about video art, I should go on to say.
but there was a little bit, because in the 60s, especially in the early 70s, there were books like Gerrymanders, the 4 arguments for the elimination of television, and
Yes.
and it also takes a very long time for the left to be interested in television because it's not to be trusted,
Right.
because it was really seen as part of the enemy, meaning the corporate world.
The corporate world, right.
And so it takes a really long time for graphics to get good among protesters, and I think that doesn't happen until the mid-'80s, even the early '90s. It was still something that you had to occasionally you'd have to have a fight about whether or not you should have graphics that look like they're professionally made, or whether you should have graphics that don't look like they're professionally made.
So we were talking about, and I'm just looking at my notes, that GBH produced The Medium is the Medium in 1969, which allowed artists to use television to make art, essentially, right?
Yes.
So I just thought.
So
maybe
I
you
don't know.
could-
I don't know how many of you saw this week's Globe magazine has an article about a television show done at WGBH in 1967-68 called "What's Happening, Mr. Silver," and Mr. Silver was a Tufts English professor, but he was also very good looking and had a British accent, and so Fred Barzak, who was a dear friend of mine, wanted to do something out of the ordinary at GBH, and he got started this show, And one of the most famous episodes of this show was called Madness and Intuition, in which Fred loaded all of the film chains and all of the projectors and all the slide projectors up with everything he had, and he had somebody on a motorcycle running around the studio, and he had some other people making out on a bed somewhere, and anytime anyone in the studio got bored, they just had to yell cut, and he would go to something else. And 20 minutes into the half-hour show, he, the director of the show, got up and walked out. One woman called GBH and claimed that the show had given her brain cancer, which Fred loves. And this made Time magazine. And as a result, the Howard Weiss Gallery asked Fred and David Atwood and his assistant to come down to New York to go to the Howard Weiss Gallery and talk about, can we do a show broadcast show of video art, because Howard Weiss was about the only person showing video art. And they got money from the Ford Foundation for it, and it was The Medium is the Medium, which is, of course, a play on Marshall McLuhan's phrase, the medium is the message. And it was not just Nam June, it was also Alan Capro, the inventor of The Happening, a whole bunch of different people in completely different, Otto Pini, who later came here to run CAVS, Aldo Tambolini. So a whole interesting group of artists came, and each made a short episode for this half-hour thing. And Nam June's asked if he could get a naked dancer, and Fred could at least get him somebody with pasties, and he would intercut that with, I'm blanking on it, Richard Nixon's vice president. Spiro Agnew. He sort of intercut between those two things. And then he created the first interactive television, because during the show, you hear Nam June's voice saying, close one eye, half close the other eye. And you were supposed to do this according to his instructions while you were watching his piece. Another aspect that Boston, so that was the first American use of a television studio by artists. Not the first ever. The first ever was Otto Pini and Aldo Tambolini in Cologne, did Blackgate Cologne, which I've seen, which is amazing, taking over a studio and going crazy with it. But I also brought this along. This is the catalog for the very first museum exhibition of video art. It was at the Rose Art Museum at Brandeis in 1972. And besides Nam June, it includes the Video Freaks from New York, Usco, who we showed recently at the gallery, Judd Ulick, Aldo Tambolini, John Riley, Frank Gillette and Ira Schneider, Rudy Stern, and Paul Ryan. So it was an amazing exhibition, Charlotte Mormon. An amazing first-time exhibition of video art in an institution, and that sort of helped kick off what then became the acceptance of video art as a serious art form.
Yeah. I should mention that CAVS is having its 50th anniversary, and it's opening tomorrow, in fact, at here at MIT. I think it's in building. I'm not used to the names of these buildings. I think it's Building 9, but it's tomorrow at 5, I believe, and it's a big exhibition of a variety of things. And there are events all week. There's a website devoted to it, if anybody's interested in CAVS, Center on Advanced Visual Studies, which is a very early and important moment in the history of the arts at MIT, and especially the question of the experimentation between art, technology, and culture, which is what ACT is part of. So.
This might be a good moment to open up to the audience, if anybody has any thoughts or questions. And Megan has a mic. Anybody want to jump in or questions or? Great.
This might be a naive question.
Wait for the mic.
Microphone. Thank you.
How you doing? Thank you first. This might be a naive question. I'm curious how video art is different than film art. It seems like film art must have been way older than the 1960s and 70s. What's the critical differences between those?
That's a good question. Actually.
Yeah, very good question. There's a very famous moment in the history of video art when Nam June had recently bought a small camcorder, but it wasn't the Steadicam. It was a version before that you had to plug in. And coming home, all of downtown New York was ground to a halt, and because the Pope was coming through town. And Namjoon climbed up, must have found a plug someplace in a store, climbed up on some object and shot the Pope. And that night he played it at an event. And what I think people got out of that was that video had this immediacy that film didn't have. If he had shot it in film, he would have had to taken the film at that time, send it to a developer. It would have taken a week or so. He would have gotten it back. This he could just immediately show everybody, hit rewind, play. And I think that's one of the clear differences between film as an art medium and video as an art medium.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I also think in the development of video, there have been many iterations of different kinds of machines that you could use to augment video. For instance, the synthesizers that many people developed, including people at MIT, were used by artists as sort of, in many ways, pre-feedback loops,
Yeah.
which George was showing tonight. And working that way also had a kind of immediacy, which is very different than the way people work when they're using compositing, where you don't do it on the fly. In video, with the synthesizer, Namjoon did most of his stuff in that moment. And when it came time for him to learn how to work using compositing, it was really hard for him because he was really used to this instant gratification. We worked at the same facility for a while, and so I think that's another really interesting moment or an interesting difference in those moments. But I also think that there's a very long history in experimental film of artists experimenting, and it goes way back to the beginnings of film. In fact, you could even look at the Méliès, A Trip to the Moon, as a really good example, 1902, of a great experimental film, which was, in many ways, invented the language that's still being used today. So I guess I don't see them as competing, but I think they do different things.
Right. And if Miel had, say, an iPhone, that he probably would have been very much very interested in what, like, in the latest newest technology to make his ideas happen.
I should on a local note add that the first Pekabe synthesizer was developed at WGBH.
Oh, really? Oh,
and it was built at WGBH, and then Namjoon left GBH. He was the very first artist in residence at WGBH. He left the GBH and he started going around the country telling other people how to build a synthesizer. But the synthesizer today is at the Kunstmuseum in Bremen, Germany. And I made a pilgrimage once just to see that. It's an iconic thing.
Well, that was a do-it-yourself moment, too.
Yeah, totally.
Which is also in the history of television, that you could build your own TV set when it first came out.
Would anybody be willing to speculate about what AI art might look like or be?
Well, what's that Philip K. Dick story? The one with the electric sheep? I think you should ask them. I don't really have any. I did see Inarutu's virtual reality work, which is quite spectacular, actually. But I don't know if this is the place to talk about that, but the film director, Inarutu, who made Birdman and among many other films, has made a 6.5-minute work that's a virtual reality work that may still be up at LACMA. And it's about people crossing the border between the US and Mexico. And it's spectacularly made. It's by far the best VR work I've ever seen. I, through a friend, was able to get a ticket and actually went out there to see it. But unfortunately, I can tell you what I thought it was claimed that it was an empathy machine. And if you saw the recent article in the Art Forum about virtual reality, they did a whole section, and there was a conversation between two people about how virtual reality produces empathy, and there have been a number of TED Talks about this. But being in that work and knowing just a little bit about it and trying to interrupt the people with the guns and the flashlights who were harassing the people that are crossing the border, you realize that even though it had a little tiny bit of motion tracking where the eyes would make contact with you, how it actually made you feel was not empathetic, but helpless, because you actually had zero agency. And it was really, it's very palpable, even with the goggles, that 3D immersive experience, but the end result isn't in any way empathy, and it's not agency. It's something else. And so it kind of makes you wonder about VR technology in that sense. I mean, we don't know what it really can do yet, but, and maybe that's not machine, the machine art that will be made in the AI world, because we don't know what the machines really think yet. But when they become sentient, we'll have to figure that out.
Well, I think the Artificial Creativity Show really was about that. Neural networks are a tool of AI.
Yeah.
And so people are using AI tools to make art today. And what it's going to look like in the future, is, I personally find this sort of interesting thing about artificial intelligence, which is that the artificial intelligence that hasn't come around yet, we're all worried about. But the stuff that has come online, we don't even give a second thought to. I mean, I don't think twice about Google Maps, but it's as intelligent a device as I've ever come across, And so once it crosses from the future to the present, it sort of loses its threat somehow. And so it was very interesting. I really enjoyed doing this show and seeing what people were doing at the most cutting edge of AI today.
Hello.
Yes.
At the ICA right now, they're showing My Boyfriend Came Back from the War, piece of net art.
Mm-hmm.
How does net art fit into your personal histories? Because you talked about video art and also interactive or video games. But also, what's your opinion on showing net art in a gallery?
You want to start with that? Or?
I think net art has a really important role to play in the history of technology, as that particular piece makes clear. And many other net pieces could also function in a gallery. I think it's a matter of context, actually, making a viewing situation where it's comfortable for the viewer to engage with something on the computer. That's often been the problem with technology-based works, which is that the viewing conditions haven't been amenable to producing a situation where a spectator or participant would want to stay in the room with the work. And so, that I think is a hurdle that hasn't quite been overcome in that sense. Even when you think about video art, it wasn't until artists started demanding a black box room that video started to be really widely acquired and seen in museums, and I would date that at about 1992, 93, and not before, when your work was if you were in a video show with single channel work and didn't have what was called an installation. Often your work would be on the way to the bathroom or in the middle of the hallway or down in the basement. And so it was, very much a ghetto, and it made the work, I think, very unpalatable for people. But, the minute they started to make black boxes, and they called those installations, by the way, even if they were single channel works, there was absolutely no difference between what they looked like in terms of video art from the 80s, the early 80s, and this black box presentation if it was a single screen, and yet it made a huge difference. All of a sudden it became collectible. So I guess my answer is it's contextually based.
I've actually shown net art in a gallery, and over the years you see, probably the first show was sometime in, I would imagine, 98, and then the last show probably was 2005. And over the years you can watch how people, those who are comfortable using computers, engage in it, and those who aren't don't. So there's this problem with especially with working on joysticks or keyboards or using even the mouse. But one interesting story is that I love to tell is that when Mark Andreessen and his team first created Mosaic at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, Joseph Squire, who at that time was in the photography department, and a couple other people got together and built the first web art site. It's called The Place. And it's still up, thanks to the Walker Art Museum, which has saved it. And now you can go and see it and work it. It's very simple, but it's sort of intriguing. But what I like to point out about this is that art was on the web before sex, before porn. Because sex.com wasn't even taken as a domain name until 2 years after The Place was up. So,
We have time for one more question.
As more and more artists adapt the medium of technology and adopt sort of the newer versions of it and take up newer versions, is there any form of sort of tech art, video art, that shape that you are sad to see sort of be phased out of the lexicon of current artists?
You're looking at me?
Yeah,
Or George.
that's a good question. I mean, when I think of art and technology, I really sort of start with someone like Masaccio. I mean, I think Masaccio was a painter who took this brand new piece of architectural software called Perspective and put it into, a mural. And that's technology. And he did it right. He did it very, very well. So there's a lot of technology that has been phased out over time. Is there a personal favorite of mine? No, I'm always sort of paying attention to what's coming next. So,
But there's also migration, and I think that
Yeah.
what a lot of artists have done, myself included, is I've migrated works that maybe would have died into a new technology while preserving what they looked like back then, because I wanted to keep the semblance of the work and not remake it.
Right.
And so I think that's, a solution somewhat. And then there's also museums that collect. And
like the Walker,
Yeah.
showing
Yeah.
not just the place, but it also shows AutoWeb. So, which is what museums should be doing, is collecting and preserving, these pieces of our cultural history.
So I think that's a good place to stop, and I want to thank you both for a wonderful immersion. Just starting to think there's so much to talk about, and we're actually we have a little reception afterwards, so we can continue this conversation. So I want to thank both Judith and George so much for our conversation.